Assalamu alaikum. Today we'll continue with Coleridge. We were talking about Coleridge as a poet, as a writer, critic, and some of his background history with Wordsworth and his sister, and of course a little bit about his writing, where he seems to have plagiarized quite a bit from borrowed material from the German writers. And we saw some of his the kind of criticism he wrote, which mainly was focused upon establishing the principles of writing rather than to furnish rules or on how to pass judgment on other people's writing, right? So his criticism is mainly focused on the creative aspect of writing poetry especially. So as far as his writing is concerned, his criticism is concerned, his philosophies are concerned, many writers have one sec. So he was mainly focused upon so I'm sorry, I was talking about his plagiarism, right? So there were many writers and critics who accused him of having borrowed or stolen ideas from other writers, especially the European writers, German writers. And speaking of his critical works, we spoke of his lectures on Shakespeare and Milton, his lectures on his a collection of lectures called Biographia Literaria. They were mainly focused on some of his key philosophies, as in organic wholeness in poetry, imagination, reconciliation of opposites. And then we spoke about his observation on what a poet ought to be. So, what the main attributes of a poet should be, right? And yeah, speaking of which, we saw that a poet is an ideal man, right? Someone who is capable of being whole, ideal, sensible, and wise, well endowed with knowledge, experience, and intuition. Moving on, we saw the basic differences he found between his distinction between fancy and imagination, and further, primary and secondary imagination. Speaking of fancy, he thought it was not a creative faculty, it merely juxtaposed ideas together to probably shape objects a little differently, right? Whereas the imagination had this ability to fuse things together rather than merely juxtaposing them. And his comparison between fancy and imagination would simply is simply carried forward with primary and secondary imagination, wherein primary imagination is made to be something that is involuntary, that happens all of its own accord, whereas secondary imagination is something that is deliberately done, and this could only be cultivated by a person of some genius, right? And moving on, there's this very small and simple definition of this distinction between primary and secondary imagination by John Ruskin. Okay, so he's John Ruskin in his Modern Painters speaks of how fancy sees the facade and imagination works with the interiors. Facade would indicate what you see from the outside. That is the exterior part of the building would be what you call facade, the front part. Okay, so fancy works with the exterior of the objects, whereas the imagination works from the interior. That is all the mysterious thing that goes into the making of that facade itself, right? So if for example, just think of a person. When you look at a person, what you see is not what that person is completely, right? So that person has so many mysterious parts to him or her that you cannot possibly get into or fathom, right? So yes, so John Ruskin says that fancy sees the facade and imagination works with the interiors, while fancy gives a detailed account of the exterior, clear, brilliant. Imagination works with the inner nature of things, obscure, mysterious, and interrupted. So while fancy works with the outside of things, that is clear, that is brilliant, that is, or at the superficial level, it is fantastic, all the witty things that you talk about, right? They are great to see and observe. But what imagination is something that works from within, that goes beneath and beyond. In my last class, we went through two poems. to his coy mistress, and Kubla Khan. I believe one could easily, I mean, in my estimation, in my very humble estimation, I could say that to his coy mistress would be something that is created only with the faculty of fancy, whereas Kubla Khan would have required the secondary imagination of a poetic genius, right? So, further, the primary imagination is the living power and prime agent of all human perception in the finite mind. Finite mind would indicate the extent to which our conscious mind can understand and interpret. So, primary imagination is the power and agent of all human perception, all that our mind can observe and understand in its finite ability. Finite as in like limited ability. All right, our mind has this limited ability that you can that can perceive. Perceive would mean understand or absorb or explain to itself or decipher to itself things that it sees, right? That is perception. All right, so our finite mind, in its limited ability, whatever it can understand and perceive is what primary imagination is concerned with. The secondary imagination is an echo of the former. So what the secondary imagination does is actually echoes. So when you shout out in vacuum, and I mean, imagine a place, a huge place where there is nothing else, and when you shout out, you actually get to listen to the echo, something that echoes back to you. The same thing is echoed back to you. So fancy is something, I'm sorry, I think I missed out on that part. Yeah. So fancy is something that works from the exterior, that is the I'm sorry, I lost track of my train of thought because of some disturbance here. So I had to leave in the middle, and when I came back, I'm sorry. Once again, I apologize for the disturbance in between. So we were speaking of the primary and secondary imagination, right? So the primary imagination is the power that is of the finite mind, what our mind can perceive in its limited ability. Whereas secondary imagination is the echo of the former, as in like if you're like shouting out in a vacuum, your voice echoes back. The quality of the voice would differ, right? The voice that comes out of your mouth would be more lifelike, a little more something that is more concrete probably, and the one that is echoed back to you, it would be more mysterious, of a more mysterious bent. It would be a little more of a little obscure, or something that is kind of distorted, or just or another better analogy I think would be you standing in front of a water body, probably looking at the reflection of yourself, your image on water. Probably you as a person would be something that can be simply be if you compare yourself to the image of you, that is the person standing to primary imagination, the reflection on the water could be compared to the secondary imagination, which is so distorted. And imagine the sun rays falling on water, and your image, the sun's image, coming together. And can you imagine it, the rays shooting off from the water and distorting your image, and how they both seem to blend together to form a whole new image out there? Can you imagine it in your mind's eye? I mean, if you do possess some imagination, you'd be able to do it brilliantly. See, imagination is something that cannot be explained in specific terms. Imagination can come up with things that need not be explained. There are things that can be explained in crisp specific scientifically concrete terms, right? Which whereas imagination can cook up things that need not that cannot be explained in such very crisp, specific, delineated forms, right? uh, so see, he says the secondary imagination is an echo of the former. It dissolves, diffuses, dissipates. Dissolves as in it mixes together so that you cannot, remove the particles from the solution, right? It diffuses, it spreads everywhere. It's so much so that it just loses its own self. The object that you mix with another object, they cannot be, separated at all. It dissipates, it completely, becomes a part of the other. In order to recreate, struggles to idealize and unify. Fancy, on the contrary, has no other counter to play with, but fixity is indefinite. So fancy has nothing else for it, but fixity is indefinite. Fixity is indefinite as in what is there is simply explained in fixed, definite terms. Alright, it doesn't have anything else to work with. Fancy is indeed no other than a mode of memory emancipated from the order of space and time. So you see, time and space. You see, fancy is nothing but something that is removed, that is freed from its specific place in time and space. As in, everything is fixed in terms of, the time and space, right? Temporal and spatial, right? So when you remove a certain object from its time and space and you put it elsewhere, so that it becomes a, that it is used elsewhere in some other form, right? Emancipated from its time and space, that particular object is merely used in a fanciful manner. That's it. Fancy is using it in a certain way. Whereas imagination would actually make it a part of, would completely crush it, crumble it, mix it together with something else, some another idea, some another object, and recreate it in a wholly new sense, which is completely different, completely, absolutely irrecognizable from where it first belonged. You get my point? So fancy and imagination can be understood in these terms. In my opinion, in my humble opinion, this is how I understand Coleridge's philosophy of primary, secondary, and fancy. Primary and secondary imagination and fancy. So he believes a creative genius would actually have possession of this ESEMPLASTIC power. It is the unifying, according to him, it is the unifying or modifying power that identifies mind with nature, right? So this is the power that identifies mind, mind as in what you think, your perception, with nature, and is the mark of a creative genius. Only a genius would possess this ability, this power. A unity of interest is achieved. Unity of interest is achieved as in, a complete focus upon one particular whole is achieved, and an organic compound is created. So all things come together to create one particular theme, one particular idea. All right, and an organic compound is created as in it does not have any disparate loose ends. Disparate as in, disparate is different from desperate. So we are talking about disparate in a separate loose ends. It does not have any of those. It is complete, as in it is fully rounded. There is no loose ends to it, no loose threads to it. An organic compound is created with this power, which is more effective than the mechanical unities of time, place, and action. So it is much better, it is more stronger, more effective than the mechanical unities of time, place, action, all of it. See, for instance, you are required to understand a narrative. I mean, you are required to create a narrative with these three in mind, right? That is, at least that's what Aristotle tells you, right? There should be a unity of time, place, action. So what Coleridge says is that just putting a narrative in a certain setting, following certain, unities, is not enough. It's not sufficient. All right, because you plan the situation separately, and you try to fit in, as in like you're trying to fit in a circle in a square box, a round or spherical object in a very short square box. It's not really possible, right? It has to be flexible enough. But see, and that would be purely mechanical, as in like I believe you remember Wordsworth, how he said that you don't need to have any separate language for poetry, and any language, any prose language would be fine enough to relate the narrative in poetic form. All you need to do is to add the form over it, like as in like meter need to be super added. That's enough. You don't have to really have a separate language for poetry. At least that's what the new classical writers did, right? So see, you could say that Coleridge is acting against it in this term. So here we are not we'll talk about form and content later, but for now try to understand that Coleridge was opposed to the idea of placing a narrative within the unities. Okay, to him, it should come from within. I mean, like the form itself should originate from the content. All right. So more effective than the mechanical unities of time, place, and action, a mere mixture in comparison. Imagination is the ESEMPLASTIC power, also known as coordinating or unifying power, that modifies and molds images into a new whole. The method of creation in the arts is based on fine arts and is based on knowledge, experience, and the intuitive conception of the artist. So you see, imagination is the ESEMPLASTIC power, that is that all creators of fine arts possess, it seems. And the whole, he believes that the method of creation in fine arts is based on knowledge, experience, and intuitive conception of the artist. As in knowledge, these three things are crucial for the artist: knowledge, experience, and intuitive conception. Knowledge would be what he has learned, experience would be what he has experimented and learned, and intuitive conception would be his own intuitive, I mean what he feels would be better, his own ideas that are formed intuitively in his mind, right? Coleridge terms this power as ESEMPLASTIC power. Now, speaking of organic formalism, this is what I talked about earlier. Organic formalism would indicate the form and content should be organic whole. It should be one organic whole. As in organic in the sense, like organic would simply indicate something that is opposite to mechanical, probably, right? So when we say organic formalism, Coleridge at least means to say that the form and content should be inseparable. Okay, you should not be able to separate either of them. So, as I said earlier, speaking of Wordsworth, how he wanted, to use language of prose for poetry, and meter should be simply superadded to poetry. That should suffice. That was Wordsworth's idea. Coleridge is opposed to that idea, and he says that the form should originate in the content itself, from the content itself. Content would be what is said. Content would be what you are trying to tell. The form would be how you are telling it. So, what and how? What is being said? How is it being said? The content, form. Now, the form should come from the content itself. That's the idea of Coleridge, as opposed to Wordsworth. He believed that all art achieves its form from within, with no imposition from without. It should not be imposed from outside. You see, no imposition from without would mean it should not come from outside. It should come from within. While talent and fancy combine mechanically, genius and imagination organically unify. You see, just because you have some talent, just because you have some fancy, see, it's like playing a keyboard. I mean, piano, when you play it, You may have a certain talent. You may be fanciful enough to create some, probably, use a set of tunes that were used by Bach or Mozart, or and you put them together to probably, juxtapose a couple of keys, you know some minor, some major tunes put together and create some tune, right? So it's not really, this talent alone, or some fancy alone would not suffice. It would create something. You would be able to mechanically put together a tune, but a genius in imagination is required to organically unify that tune. That's what's lacking in most of the musicians, actually. I mean, or artists, painters, for that matter. So the masterpieces that were created probably by Michelangelo, or probably by Mozart, or probably by you know so many there are so many writers and sculptors and musicians, or and painters, right? So the masterpieces created by them, they were the works of geniuses. Okay, it required genius and imagination, and that's why they are so organically united. All right, to become all things and yet remain the same, to make the changeful God be felt in the river, the lion and the flame, that is true imagination. See, to become all things and yet remain the same. You become all of it and still retain your individuality. To make the changeful God be felt in the river, to make you feel God and still be felt in the river, the lion and the flame. That is true imagination. You should be able to feel God everywhere, just about everywhere, in every single object, in every single thing. That's how you reach God through His creation, right? The Creator through creation. So that is the work of imagination. That's the work of genius, at least as far as Coleridge is concerned. His literary criticism, he introduced new trends in interpreting Shakespeare. Neither are they character criticism nor image school criticism, as in he did not focus upon characters alone, nor did he focus on image schools. Creating images. Okay, neither image schools. Applying his theory of organic formalism, he showed how Shakespeare's characters show an organic existence and not a mechanical one. His literary criticism could be divided into three categories. So before we proceed, you need to understand that Shakespeare's characters, when you look at most of its characters, you would be able to sympathize not merely with with the victims, even the victimizers to some extent. When you feel sorry for Antonio and Bassanio, you would simultaneously be feeling sorry or empathizing with Shylock, because Shylock has, he's more human than a mere villain. But again, when you speak of Ariel and Caliban, again, Caliban is not merely, he is not despised. Caliban, it is not despised. Caliban being an it is not despised, even though you do seem to favor Ariel most of the time. It's Caliban who takes away all your sympathy, because it is the most abhorred of the creatures in the island, right? And again, Guru Othello, you would find that not only do you do you feel a sort of a condescending sympathy for Othello for being so judgmental, or your anger may be divided between both Othello and Desdemona, for Desdemona for being the kind of I'm sorry, something happened with my phone. So my point here is that he applied his theory of organic formalism to all his characters, as in his characters come off as not mechanical. He does not create caricatures. He does not create wholly good or wholly bad people. He creates people with whom you can sympathize with, admire and appreciate, and at the same time feel alive with. That's why his characters are so complete. They are wholesome. Okay, he does not mechanically create those characters. All right. His literary criticism could be divided into three categories: Shakespearean criticism, critique of Wordsworth, criticism on various poets. So, this is another way of looking at his criticism, wherein he focused upon Shakespeare's writings, some of Wordsworth's writing, because see, Wordsworth and Coleridge had this sort of love-hate relationship all through their careers, right? So, beginning they were best friends. Gradually, they moved apart, but still, they always managed to comment upon each other's ideas. Okay, not merely writings, but ideas. In fact, and they were not entirely negative, in the sense that they were not always at odds with each other. There were times when Coleridge appreciated Wordsworth for his writing, for the kind of writing he's produced, and vice versa. But nevertheless, Coleridge always managed to squeeze in some critique of Wordsworth in his lectures and writings. Again, he commented upon various other poets and writers as well. So this was the basis of his criticism. In conclusion, Coleridge differs from all of his predecessors and contemporaries in that he introduced the psychological approach to literary problems. His ideas on poetic genius, poetic diction, fancy and imagination, objectivity, and the essential sense of the musical delight created through dramatic illusion paved way for I'm sorry, I had to stop once again. So, his ideas on poetic genius, poetic diction, fancy, imagination, objectivity, and the essential sense of musical delight created through dramatic illusion paved way for numerous schools of critical thought. As in, as I said earlier, he differed from most of his predecessors. Predecessors, in the sense, the ones who, the writers who came before him, he differed from his predecessors and his contemporaries because he introduced a psychological approach. Psychological approach, as in how we discussed about his anticipating Freudian psychology. The part where mind is divided into two separate spaces, the conscious and the unconscious mind, right? So he had the psychological approach. He anticipated the psychological approach to literary problems, and his idea on poetic genius, poetic diction, fancy, and imagination. So, as far as his poetic diction is concerned, he opposed Wordsworth's idea of using any ordinary language for writing poetry, language of the real men. No, he did not agree with that. He believed that language of real men can never be the form of poetry, because cannot be used for poetry, because poetry is supposed to be something that makes the ordinary seem extraordinary, and that could only be achieved through the words that are used in it, right? So the poetic diction need to be specialized, of a more refined quality, right? And also we've spoken at length about fancy and imagination, how fancy and imagination work. I wouldn't go into it again. Objectivity, as in how any poet should deal with the subject objectively and not subjectively, as in it should not be general. I mean, while Wordsworth focused upon specific people, of real people, Wordsworth focused upon, Wordsworth wanted it to be universal. He wanted his subjects to be not specific, but general. All right. So you should be able to look at it objectively. So that was his idea of objectivity. And the essential sense of musical delight, how musical delight is essential for creating good poetry through dramatic illusion. So he paved way for numerous schools of critical thought, as in because of him, so many the new formalists, the Russian formalists, the new critics of the 20th century, all of them formed their opinions based on Coleridge's criticism, or they fashioned their criticism on Coleridge's criticism. I believe I would end here and probably start with a new topic in my next class. For now, this is all for now. Thank you so much for your patient listening. Stay safe. Be happy. Assalamu alaikum.